Hi everyone, welcome back to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel. If you're joining us for the first time, it's great to have you. We are the UK's leading pro-marriage organisation. That means we've got tens of thousands of individuals and groups who support this thing, man-woman marriage. And our supporters come from all faiths and none. A lot of you are Christians, and today's guest is Professor Nancy Pearcey. Nancy is professor at the Houston Christian University. Oh, she's been on all the news channels you can imagine. She's a very popular speaker. She's written many books. And today we're going to talk about her latest book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. Nancy, I wonder, would you say hi to our viewers and our listeners? And as you're doing so, perhaps you'd give us a brief outline of some of your recent books and what they're about and why people might want to read them, as well as, of course, the one we're talking about, The Toxic War on Masculinity.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me on your show. And yes, and a very good day to your audience. Very thoughtful people, I know, because of the topics you covered. So I have written several books, and the first one actually was called The Soul of Science. And it's on the historical interplay between science and Christianity from the time of the scientific revolution. So in many ways, it was a very foundational book, since all of modern thought is based in some way on science, responding to the scientific revolution. And so understanding Christianity's role in that was really important. My next book, I think, was the one that was co-authored with Chuck Colson, called How Now Should We Live? And it's sort of a omnibus on what is a Christian worldview. And the next, I don't know if you recognize the title, it was a takeoff on one of the Francis Schaeffer's books. He had How Should We Then Live? And we said, How Now Should We Live? The next book was Total Truth. And it's still actually my best-selling book because it gives sort of an overview of how we approach the topic of truth itself.
Yep.
And so that's kind of what Total Truth is about. How can we talk to non-Christians today?
And I love that book. I really, really enjoy that book.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate that. And it is so foundational, right? If you don't have a concept of truth. And then what I discovered is, as I picked up other topics, that same concept of truth was everywhere. Sometimes it's called the fact value split. That reliable knowledge is what we have of empirical facts, what science tells us. And then values are just your personal preferences, your personal experiences. And it turns out that I think the next book I picked up was on the arts, because, again, Francis Schaeffer was known for doing what is called cultural apologetics. That term was actually coined to describe what Schaeffer did, because he did not just look at apologetics in terms of abstract arguments, but he was looking at ideas as they percolate down through cultural means, like art and literature, movies, music, even advertising. So he was teaching people how to decipher worldviews through these cultural forms. So that was my next goal is, okay, I'm going to do my version of that, look at art and literature, music, and so on, and how do they interact with the philosophies of their day. So that was my book, Saving Leonardo. After that, I did Finding Truth, and I wrote Finding Truth because I realized I was using a certain form of apologetics in all my books, but I had never made the method itself explicit. And I thought, okay, I want one book that just says, what is a biblical approach to apologetics in terms of the method itself? A method that you can apply to any ism. Because when I converted, since it was very much of an intellectual conversion, right? It was, they shot down all my secular ideas. So I thought I had a responsibility to be able to answer all the questions out there, all the secular isms of our day. And I realized that would take a lifetime if you just memorized, an argument for every counter argument. And then I wrote Finding Truth because what it does is it gives you a method or a strategy that you can apply to any religion or philosophy. And the cool thing is it's based on Romans 1. So it's not just a man-made structure, that's the thing. Even as a Christian, I could say, well, this is an interesting apologetics argument, but people came up with it. How do I know for sure that I'm not being fooled? And so my book, Finding Truth, is based on Romans 1. It unpacks an apologetics ministry from Romans 1 so that so that it's not just a man-made set of ideas. What came next? Love Thy Body. So Love Thy Body dealt with sort of cutting edge cultural issues of our day, like abortion, euthanasia, homosexuality, transgenderism. And I wrote it in 2018, and people are saying, how did you know to write on transgenderism? Because it's exploded since then.
Yep.
Yeah, I was out there, quite early and trying to educate Christians on how to deal with these issues. And then my latest book, which you mentioned, The Toxic War on Masculinity, and the whole question of, is masculinity toxic? Where did how did the secular culture get masculinity so wrong that it even dismisses it as toxic? And how can
That's
Christians
right.
answer that?
Yeah, and that's what I want to look at for, and I thoroughly recommend people to buy the book and read the book. And our supporters come from all faiths and none, Nancy. But a lot of our supporters obviously are Christians from different flavors, different denominations. Most of our supporters, I would say, are Christians, but we do have people who have no faith. We have atheists. We have people who are same-sex attracted, who just believe and support the idea of man-woman marriage as the foundational bedrock of society. So that's great. That's why we're here. But your book, the Toxic War on Masculinity, although it's written with a Christian reference, a Christian heritage, and would be appreciated by Christians, actually it deals with matters which anybody can approach and read, because you do deal very well with some of the toxic issues around masculinity today. And I wanted to touch on a few of those things. But the first thing which struck me as really interesting was when you spoke, and I came across it first in chapter 12 of Total Truth, and you pick up on it to a greater degree in the Toxic War on Masculinity. This idea of how the Industrial Revolution really changed everything in terms of family and marriage. And the picture that you paint in the book of pre-industrial revolution, and that the process that you go through with the Industrial Revolution. I wonder if you can just, for our listeners, take us through a bit of that for us.
Yes, I'm glad you started with that, because people typically think, this attack on masculinity, the idea that masculinity is toxic, that probably went back to, say, the 1960s, second wave feminism. Actually, it starts much earlier than that. Before the Industrial Revolution, men worked with their wives and children all day. So, the cultural expectation on men focused very much on their caretaking role, that they were responsible. You had to be kind and gentle because you're working with your kids, you're working with your wife. In fact, funny and interesting historical fact, most books on child rearing, on parenting back then, were addressed to fathers. Today, if you go into a typical bookstore, they're almost all to mothers. But back then, they were addressed to fathers because fathers were thought to be the primary parent. And they did, in fact, spend as much time with their children as mothers did, which is very different from what we're used to today. So how did that change? The Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, they were not working with people they loved and had a moral bond with, right? Their family members. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And this is where you see the language start to change. For the first time, you see negative language applied to the male character. People began to complain, to protest that men were losing that caretaking ethos of the colonial era, that they were becoming egocentric, self-centered, aggressive, assertive, greedy, and acquisitive. I'm using the language of the day. And making a career their idol. They literally use that language as well, that men were starting to make their career their idol. Instead of working for their family, they were now working for personal enrichment, personal advancement, and financial success, and so on. And that is when you first start to see the literature, change and become negative. And of course, if that's the cause of it, it does suggest a solution. The solution is, can we reconnect men to their families? Even in an industrial era, can we do more to reconnect men to the emotional life of their family?
Yeah. And what I thought was really interesting, I hadn't really, I mean, it's obvious when you mention it, but the idea that in a lot of cases, man and a woman would have worked together at the business in their home, and they would have brought up kids in that environment. They would have just been together working as a family unit, and respecting each other and contributing in their own different ways as a family business unit. And that everything changed when the man left the home, and therefore couldn't, because he wasn't around. Generally speaking, the work that took place in factories, labour intensive, etc. So the man would go and do it. The woman would then stay at home looking after the children. And this artificial divide was put in place that hadn't been there before, which separated women for purely child rearing and just being at home, and the men would be out earning a crust and competing, as you say. And then everything changed because of that. Quite profound, really. And I'm wondering,
and when you think that's most of human history too, right?
Yeah.
Most of human history, men and women have worked side by side on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. So today is the anomaly. This is not the norm. That husbands and wives do not work together, and that fathers are not raising their children throughout the day. We have to realize that this is not normal for most of human history.
But nevertheless, even though it seems to have had a massive impact on society, and there have been other things which you mentioned in the book, the promiscuity in the 60s, the rise of self, which Truman deals with, the idea of the pill and everything else like that, which kind of transforms them. And even the nature of work, that these days so many more women are involved in work. And let's face it, actually, when you're sat in an office using a computer, there isn't much of a significant difference between a man and a woman from that respect, that the kind of strength thing doesn't come into it, etc., etc. But nevertheless, you point out in your book that the church or Christians have had a big impact on marriage in terms of successful marriages, as opposed to non-Christian marriages, and the numbers being different. I wonder if you can just pull some of that out for us and maybe explain why that might be the case.
Yes, I was very surprised by these findings, and it is the ultimate reason I decided I had to write this book. Is the narrative today is that evangelical Christian men are exhibit A of toxic masculinity, but that if you hold to any notion of male headship in the home, that itself will turn you into an overbearing, tyrannical, abusive patriarch. It was easy to find quotes, but I'll give you just one. This was from the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So social scientists were listening to this and saying, well, you're making these accusations, but where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And I cite some dozen or so studies in my book where they discovered that evangelical Christian men who are very committed to their faith, who attend church regularly, actually test out at the top. They shatter all the negative stereotypes. They're the most loving to their wives. And by the way, they do interview the wives separately, which is important.
Yeah.
And they spend more time with their kids, 3.5 hours per week more than secular men. They have the lowest rate of divorce, 20% lower than secular men, secular couples. And the big surprise is they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any major group in America. So, I didn't expect this. And certainly it's not widely known. I had to go digging in the academic literature to find this. And I'll give you just one quote, because sometimes a quote can crystallize it. But one of my favorite sociologists, he did the largest study. His name is Brad Wilcox. He teaches at the University of Virginia.
Yeah, we know and love Brad Wilcox. We've spoken to him a couple of times.
Yeah, I figure that. He's certainly my favorite sociologist. And to give you a sense of his stature, he gets published in places like the New York Times. So this quote is from a New York Times article. In this article, he said, It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. And of course, they focus on the wives because the assumption is that these marriages are oppressive to the wives. So, no, it turns out the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. And then he turns to his colleagues, most of whom are secular. Sociology is a very secularized discipline. And he says, and again, this is a direct quote, academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and against evangelicals in particular. Conservative, evangelical, Protestant married men with children are consistently the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. So this is why I had to write this book. It's because, the churches don't know this. They need to know that they need to be encouraging men. I had a graduate student who was the head of the women's ministry of a large Baptist church here in Houston, where I lived. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. And I thought, okay, we need to stop the scolding. And then, of course, we need to get this literature out to the public sphere as well, because it shatters the secular narrative. And it's not a pep talk from some religious leader. It is solid empirical research. These are evidence-based findings that completely debunk the secular narrative.
Yep. Great stuff. And your book is full of evidence and research, and that's another really good reason for people to read it. As well as referring to Christian husbands, Christian men, you touch on masculinity per se, and the title of the book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, and society's degradation of the role of male and man. I wonder, just talk more generally on that and what you bring up in the book on that for us.
Well, people when you write a book like this, of course, one of the first things people ask you is, well, what do you think are the differences between men and women? Yeah. And I think we should start with the biological differences, because other differences grow out of those to a large extent. But we just have to say men are bigger, stronger, faster, 75% greater upper body muscle mass, 90% greater upper body strength. Oh, and what was it? I just ran into another stat the other day, something like 35% greater punching power. Any woman who's been abused knows that. And because of testosterone, men are, in general, more aggressive and more risk-taking. And so I think we should start with just affirming those gifts, because today, the message of toxicity is so pervasive that it's a big deal just to say, let's look at the basic biological differences and say these are creational givens. If in a Christian perspective, these are before the fall. These are the way God made men, and however God makes things, are things that we should affirm. Even in my class, I teach at Houston Christian University, and when I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." Okay, even in a Christian high school, this was a college. But I was thinking about high school because I also received an email from a former student who now teaches high school. And she said, "What should I do? All my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're even using Andrew Tate quotations in the yearbook."
Oh, dear.
And I said, what school do you teach at? She said, "A classical Christian school." So that was another thing I wanted to explain in my book. Where did the Andrew Tate phenomenon come from? On the one hand, where did we get the idea of masculinity as a negative? But secondly, why has it in fact become more negative over time? So I do put a lot of devote a lot of space to the history of how secular ideas of masculinity have changed, and how we got to the point of Andrew Tate. Fast cars, fast money, fast women, and so many young men are being drawn in.
Yeah, and making his money out of selling women's bodies online, effectively.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes, I heard him in he gave an interview where he called himself a pimp, and said, yeah, what I do is produce pornography. So he, from his own mouth.
Not one of our guests, but nevertheless, you talk in the book about how and let's not pass by the fact that the houses that you and I are speaking from right now, the buildings were built by men, the roads we drive on were built by men. The idea that we absolutely desperately need men with strength and staying power who are willing to give themselves physically until they fall down in order to deliver and build things and get things working and go out in the rain and the hail and the storm and fix fallen power lines and all that sort of stuff, without whom none of it would work. So, great that that's there. And of course, the sort of toxic masculinity that you were referring to with people like Tate, we're not interested in. But then you mentioned in the book this idea that actually the idea of wonderful masculinity is working for and defending your family and raising them well and sticking around and sacrificing and contributing. And the idea that we need to restore the nature of masculinity to include those things as manly, as attractive, and as things that males should aspire to. Tell us a little bit about that.
I'm going to give you two studies. One of the things that's unique about my book is that I give a lot of studies, and not all of them from a Christian perspective. So these are both done by non-Christian. The first one was an anthropologist, and he wrote a book that was the first cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. And of course, he found some differences, but what was most striking is that he found a common code of manhood all around the globe. And he summarizes it as the 3 Ps that every culture expects the good man to provide, protect, and procreate, meaning, become a father, raise the next generation, be involved in the future. So I read that and I thought, well, that's incredibly encouraging, because this seems to be innate. It's inherent and it's universal. He found it all around the world. There's this innate sense of what it means to be a good man. And I would say is because they're made in God's image. Right? They do know what it means to be a good man, and like you said, take care of their families. And then the second study was done by a sociologist, and he found something similar, but he found an additional wrinkle. He found that there's kind of 2 competing scripts for masculinity that are universal. So he, as a sociologist, he gets invited to speak all around the world. And so he came up with a clever experiment where he would ask young men 2 questions. The first one was, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and then in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And the sociologist said, all around the globe, young men had no trouble answering that. They would immediately start listing honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy. I like that one. Be a protector, be a provider, be responsible. And he would ask them, where'd you learn that? And they'd say, I don't know, it's just in the air we breathe. Or if they were in a Western country, they would often say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. But then he would have a follow-up question. And he'd say, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, be competitive, suck it up, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language.
Interesting.
Yes, and so this sociologist concluded that there is a universal, innate sense of what it means to be the good man. And I think that as Christians, we might call that part of general revelation too, right? What people just know inherently by being made in God's image, living in God's world, as opposed to special revelation, which is the Bible. But they also feel this cultural pressure to live up to the quote unquote real man, which not all of those traits are necessarily bad, of course. In a crisis, you want people who can stand tough. But after the crisis, you want them to go back to being the good man. And the trouble, of course, today is that the good man is being decoupled from the real man, where it can and then become traits that we might consider more toxic, like entitlement, dominance,
Yeah.
control. And
Yeah.
Andrew Tate, again. Yeah, and there's a new influencer, if you haven't heard of him yet. His name is Myron Gaines, and the New York Post just wrote an article on him, calling him the new Andrew Tate.
Right.
And his slogan is, "I help men transform from simps into pimps."
Oh,
So that's his slogan.
well, I won't be looking that up, but okay. Yeah, but you're right, and you talk wonderfully in the book about how we need to restore the fact that the providing as the protecting, providing, that actually your job isn't just to procreate, but actually manliness is staying around and protecting and providing, and nurturing your family. That's what real manliness is. And that actually requires a sacrifice. So you don't just indulge your worldly pleasures all the time, but you do what's right and you do what's good and you bring about the best version of the next generation. And that actually is fulfillment. And that brings about the kind of pleasure that none of those other temporal things do, which is astonishing. And you that comes across really well in the book, and the research around that is very good and very inspiring, in fact.